Hello, everyone. Hello, true creatives, and welcome to another very special live episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm sure you've heard of our next guest. With nearly 2 million followers on LinkedIn, she's one of the most popular and influential innovation thought leaders out there. I'm, of course, talking about Whitney Johnson. She's been ranked in the top 10 of the top 50 leading business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She's an expert in smart growth leadership, and she's an award-winning author, world-class keynote speaker, and host of the Disrupt Yourself podcast. Whitney, it's wonderful having you here today.
Nick, I am so honored that you would invite me on.
So, Whitney, just in case there's someone out there who doesn't know about you and your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Absolutely. So my brief background is that I worked on Wall Street at the beginning of my career. I actually started as a secretary. Prior to that, I was a music major. So I'm very familiar with personal disruption, which we'll talk about a little bit. But as I worked on Wall Street and I was an equity analyst, I had this big aha that I was actually more interested in the momentum of people than I was of stocks. And so I disrupted myself, left Wall Street, but wasn't quite ready to go do the people thing yet. And so I had come across the work of Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, and had the great privilege of co-founding the Disruptive Innovation Fund with him, and did that from 2007 to 2012. But another aha came along for me, which is that disruption isn't just about products and services. It's about people, that we can disrupt ourselves. And so that was a really important discovery and insight for me. And in 2012, I made the decision that I was going to sell my stake in the Disruptive Innovation Fund, and have since then built out intellectual property around the idea of personal disruption, the S curve of learning, which we can talk more about in just a minute, and how do people grow, and what does growth look like, and how do you help people grow so that you can help a company grow, and then we wrap coaching and workshops around that. And so that's my quick background of started as a music major, and that now I'm the CEO of Disruption Advisors, which is a tech-enabled talent development company.
Now, one of the things we're obviously here to talk to you about is your new book, Smart Growth. I think it's how to grow your people and use them to grow your company. I think growth itself is something that a lot of companies talk about wanting. There's positions like head of growth, but when it comes down to it, when they talk about growth, usually it's the dollars or the users or some other very clear metric about something that should be going in the upward trajectory. When you're talking about growth, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about all of that, but I'm focusing on the causal mechanism. So as I said a minute ago, stocks, people momentum versus stock momentum, personal disruption versus product disruption. The third insight that I had as we were investing was that we could use the S curve. And this is something that was popularized 50, 60 years ago by Everett Rogers, a sociologist. And he looked at how groups changed, and we used it at the Disruptive Innovation Fund to think about how quickly an innovation would be adopted. But then I had the thought, well, can't this help us explain how people change, how individuals change? That whenever you start something new, you're at the base of that S, and it's going to feel like a slog and feel overwhelming and discouraging. And it's not that growth isn't happening, just like with the S curve, but it's not apparent, so it's going to feel slow. And then you're going to move into the sweet spot where you're figuring things out and it's no longer too hard, but it's still not too easy. All of your neurons are firing. You feel exhilarated. This is that steep back of the curve, and we call that the sweet spot. This is where growth not only is fast, it feels fast. And then you get into mastery, and this is the place where you have that experience of, oh, I've figured things out, and you've plateaued because you're no longer learning. And so growth is in fact slow. So you've got slow and then fast and then slow is how you grow. And you've now got this simple mental model to understand what growth looks like. Now, to your question, my assertion, my premise is that the fundamental unit of growth in any organization is the individual. If you want your organization to grow, you need to start with growing yourself. And this S curve of learning helps you understand. It's a simple visual model, which therefore makes it useful to think about your own growth. And when you understand the emotional arc of your own growth and you are growing, then you're giving permission and you're modeling for people around you how to grow. And if you and everyone in your organization is growing, by default, by default, your organization will grow.
Now, I think for people listening to us, the reason it's called an S curve, as Whitney described, it's the shape and the speed at which things are changing. So you start out at the bottom, things are actually a very gentle slope. At some point, you hit this inflection point and things rise very rapidly, and then at the end, they seem to plateau off a little bit. So it forms this S shape. But what's this S shape based on, Whitney? When we think about learning and especially development, what people expect to happen is that you start something, you've got an end goal in mind, and you can effectively measure piece by piece what's going to get you from A to B. So it should be quite a linear relationship.
Yes. Well, we want it to be a linear relationship, but it is not. So again, this was based on Roger's work and what he found and how groups change. But let's talk about the individual and what's going on in your brain. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, Smart Growth, is I had this hypothesis. I had made a vast intuitive leap, as one of my colleagues described it, of, yes, I think this applies to how individuals change. But the purpose of this book was to take all of the qualitative stories, look at psychology, look at neuroscience, look at biology, and start to say, does this in fact mimic to some extent the experience that we are having when we grow? So here's what's going on in your brain. You start something new, you have this predictive model, and you're making all sorts of predictions about what it's going to take to be successful in this job or on this project, since we're talking about creativity and innovation. You make these predictions, but at the launch point, a lot of your predictions are going to be incorrect because you don't know what you're doing yet. And because those predictions are incorrect, your dopamine is going to drop, which makes it feel really awkward and uncomfortable and discouraging. Plus, you're in information cognitive overload because your brain is literally making memories. You're mapping the territory of this S curve. And you've got identity issues because you're no longer who you were. Now you're who you're going to be. And who is that? And so what's happening at that launch point, and if you look at biology and lily pads, you've got all sorts of stems that are going down into the mud, and it's all in this muck. But those stems haven't gone up to the surface of the water and created these lily pads yet. It's all below the surface. And so the experience that you're having is growth may be happening, but it is not apparent. So all I feel is slow. I just feel like it's a slog. But then the reason in the sweet spot it feels fast is that you're getting better at making predictions, and your predictions are increasingly accurate. And because they're accurate, the dopamine, that chemical messenger of delight, is saying, this works, this works, this works. Lots of emotional upside surprises. So the growth at this point not only is fast, because it was fast at the launch point, but now it feels fast because it feels good. It feels exhilarating. And then in mastery, what's interesting about mastery is because your brain has figured out the model, it is no longer actually getting very much dopamine. So at the launch point, the dopamine drops. In the sweet spot, it goes up a lot. And in mastery, there's very little because there's nothing new here. There's nothing new. You don't see anything new. You're not making memories. So time appears to go very fast, but the growth is slow. And so that's why there's this sense of that it's not linear, because it isn't linear. There's the slow and then the fast and then the slow.
I mean, is that inevitable? You hear a lot of high performance people talking about being in the state of flow, where things come easily, but at the same time, they are continuing to push themselves a bit further than they were previously. And they can do this for years and years. So is it inevitable that everyone reaches this plateau where there's nothing new left to grow into? Or can you change the shape of this S curve to extend it?
Nick, it's a both and. So I would argue that the sweet spot is that place of optimized tension, that place of flow, where it's hard but not too hard, easy but not too easy. And you absolutely can extend that out for a very long time. One person that we profiled in our book, Build an A-Team, was Gary Ridge, who's been the CEO of WD-40 for 20 years. And oftentimes people say, well, you can only be a CEO for a few years. No, you can be a CEO for a very long time. But what's happening is that every time you get to a mini Mount summit, you figure out a way to say, this isn't the summit, it is a summit. And so you're able to stay in a role for a very long time. You know, neuroscientists or rocket scientists need to be able to stay on that same S curve and find a way to optimize that tension. That being said, in order for us to truly grow, we need to be able to navigate the entire growth cycle. We need to be able to navigate a launch point and be new at something, because staying in that optimized place for a long time means that you're navigating some new. It also means that you need to be able to get to the top of an S curve and know it's time for me to do something new, and be able to make that decision to continue to grow. And I would actually argue that peak performance isn't just in that sweet spot. Peak performance is an ability to navigate the entire growth cycle.
You mentioned that one of the people quoted in the book is a very successful longtime CEO. I know you've got some other successful case studies from Ed Catmull to TV personalities to other interesting people. When you look at these high performing people from the outside, often you just see the success that they've achieved. And I know from my own experience and from a lot of the research, when people try to start something and they feel this challenge at the beginning, they often give up because they see someone else doing it so easily, and that makes them feel even more insecure about their performance. What did you find from looking at these case studies about how they went through their own S-curves?
Well, I'll talk about case studies, but I'll talk about my own experience as well. So I think it is very hard to start new things. It's very hard to create. It's very hard to innovate. And one of the difficulties is that the older you get, the more you can structure your environment such that you don't ever have to do anything new. So it's interesting, right? Because when you're younger, you're actually pretty good at doing new things, but you don't have the experience to know how to navigate the process. The older you get, you have the experience of how to navigate the process, but you don't have to, so you can get very lazy. So what I have found in terms of navigating the launch point is this ability to, number one, know that the experience that you're having is supposed to be uncomfortable. Just, oh, I'm at the launch point right now. There was a CTO that took our S-Curve Insight tool who'd been in a role for probably 7 years and was feeling a bit bored and needed to do something new, wanted to stay at the company, didn't want to move. So he took on some new responsibilities, and they were making him feel very uncomfortable because he's supposed to be the expert. And now he's doing this stuff where he feels awkward. But being able to have this S-curve language to talk about growth, it gave him permission and this ability to talk to his team and say, hey, you know, we grow here. And growing means we're going to sometimes do things that we don't do very well. So right now, doing this new stuff, I'm at the launch point. It's kind of uncomfortable, but that's what it looks like. And so I'm talking about it out loud. And by doing that, it diffuses that sense of enormity and challenge. So that's the first thing of navigating the launch point. The second thing that I find to be very helpful is to set small, ridiculously small goals. So we've heard about that from James Clear in Atomic Habits. I just interviewed Jeff and Jamie Downs, who talk about streaking, setting streaks for yourself at the launch point. And what I would say is, because your dopamine's dropping, it's very hard to just keep going. But if you can set really laughably small goals for yourself, like, okay, I want to write a book, or okay, I want to paint something, or I want to innovate. Instead of saying I'm going to write a page today, or I'm going to paint a picture today, you say, I'm going to pick up my paintbrush for a minute every day for a week. And what does that do? That tells your brain, I had a goal, I met it. I probably beat it because I'm probably going to do more than a minute a day. You start to get the dopamine. You start to lay the tracks, the neural pathways that give you that momentum that you need that will help move you off the launch point of the curve. And then the third thing I would say for people at the launch point, navigating the creativity and the innovation is, so first of all, know that it's normal. Second of all, set those small, ridiculously small goals. And then third, what you want to do is have an accountability. Say what you're going to do by when to someone, because when you do that, the odds that you will accomplish it go up from like 10 or 20% to 90 or 95%. And those three things will help you gain momentum off the launch point of a new creative or innovative endeavor.
I just got through James Clear's Atomic Habits as well, which kudos to him. I think it's the #1 book in the world at the moment. And one of the examples he gives is if you want to become better at flossing your teeth, don't say, I'm going to floss all my teeth every day. Start by just saying, I'm going to floss one tooth. Something that's actually ridiculously small, but it's the active action, getting into it and starting doing it, that usually that drives you to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does make a difference. I'm currently on a streak of learning Korean for 5 minutes every day. And I'm like day 80, because even if it's 9 o'clock at night and I forgot to do it, I can do it. And the reason I'm studying Korean is because part of the pandemic was I got really into Korean dramas. So I'm like, let's learn a little bit of Korean. It's been really fun.
So you mentioned that there's some good case studies in the book. You also mentioned that you're going to tell us a little bit about your own S-curve experiences. So what happened there?
Yeah. So first of all, I wouldn't have known this then. I mean, I didn't come across these ideas until 10, 12 years ago. But if you think about, you all can do this. You can map your life as a series of S-curves. And so you can think about your high school years, your secondary school years, is an S-curve. You start at the bottom and then you get to the top and then you graduate and then you jump to the bottom of a new S-curve and you go to university. Many people who are on this, maybe not all, but you start at the bottom first year and then you get to the top and you feel like, okay, it's time for me to graduate. Like, I'm not going to stay here forever. And then you can think about your, at least for me, my very first job working on Wall Street was an S-curve. I got to the top of being a secretary and then I jumped to the bottom of being an equity analyst. Well, actually I got pushed to the bottom. They moved me, shoved me. Then I got to the top of the S-curve as an equity analyst. I was there for 8 years. And then I did that. And I left to become an entrepreneur. And so that was a new S-curve of becoming an entrepreneur, working with Clayton. And then I got to the top of that curve. And then now I'm on this curve of being an entrepreneur. And to your question is, where am I? I'm at the launch point, the sweet spot, mastery. I would say I'm in the sweet spot overall, but that doesn't mean there aren't certain areas of what I'm doing where I would say I'm in mastery. And there are other areas where I'm definitely at the launch point.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. The initial examples you gave were very sequential. You start you're in high school, you're on that curve. You go to college, you're on that curve. You start at your first job, you're on that curve. But the more I'm listening to it, the more I'm reflecting on my own life, where very infrequently is anyone in their own life literally just doing one thing and nothing else. Perhaps when you get to the level of Olympic athletes preparing for the Olympic Games, you have really that one singular focus. But in most of our lives, we have our job, we've got our relationships, we've got our friendships, we've got our personal interests. We might even have sort of side interests beyond work. And it sounds like each of those would be a separate curve that you're working on simultaneously.
That's absolutely right, Nick. And I love that observation that so talk a lot about how you can manage your team and your organization as a portfolio of S-curves. And we published a piece in Harvard Business Review on that this month. But you're pointing out the fact that your life is a portfolio of S-curves. So you've got your work S-curve and you've got your family S-curve and you've got your podcasting S-curve. You've got this whole portfolio of curves. And what you're working on doing is balancing that portfolio. And so that's why sometimes I've come across this not infrequently, where someone will say, well, this person's been in this role for 7 years and they don't want to move. And my question to them is, well, are they at the top of the S-curve? Are they doing a good job? Are they showing up? Are they engaged? And their answer is, well, yeah, they are. And I'll say, well, then they're in the sweet spot of their S-curve at work. And it might be that they've made that choice, that they don't want to be this S curve, sort of moving through lots of them, because they have other S curves that are very important to them, whether it's aging parents, or they've got children at home that they want to spend time with, or they've got a massive hobby or side hustle that they want to focus on. And so they're making some choices around, do I want one major S curve, or do I want 3 or 4? And I'm figuring out how to balance each of those.
It's probably also where the brain's getting its dopamine hit, or if there's several that are maybe challenging at the same time, able to turn down the pace on one to allow you to be able to focus on something else.
That's right.
So we've talked a lot about individuals and their personal S-curves in their own lives, but I know this applies to more than just an individual. You can have teams going through challenges, trying to accomplish a larger goal, and maybe even entire companies that are on a S-curve trajectory.
Right.
So what's different when it goes to more than one person?
Yeah. So when it's more than one person, so you're a manager, and what you can do is, as a leader, look at where everyone is on your team on the S curve. But you can also ask yourself, well, a couple of things. Number one is you can use this as an artifact to think about talent development, retention, and recruiting. So you can use it for all those things. But when you're thinking about configuring a team, what you want to do is start as a baseline. Think about a standard bell curve distribution, that you want to have about 60% of your people in the sweet spot, because that's that place of optimized tension. You don't want more than 20% at the launch point, because even though they are able to ask lots of questions that can lead to innovation, they need support, and they need training, and they need more attention in order to move into the sweet spot. You do want to have people in mastery, but not more than 20%, for a couple of reasons. Number one is that they are starting to get bored, and so you're going to have to find something new for them to do. But also, if you've got, well, actually, the main reason is if you've got a whole team that has worked as a cohort and all moved up to mastery at once, you're going to have a massive either exodus if you don't know how to help them jump to a new curve, or a whole group of people that are very complacent. But as a starting point, again, depending on what is your team's trying to get done, depending on if you're a startup versus a very established company, a good starting place for you is 60% sweet spot, 20% launch point, 20% mastery, as you think about, okay, what do I need to do to optimize my growth? Where do I need to have my people in their learning?
It's a very interesting way to think about it, because that proportion, as people move through the curve, means that some people are going to be rising up the curve into mastery, and they might need to be replaced to make sure the proportions are still right, and replaced by people lower down the curve. So that reminds me of the research by Brian Uzi on what makes high-performance creative teams, and teams that stay together too long can end up being less innovative, less productive, because you end up getting this status quo of how a team works together. And instead, an injection of new blood usually helps solve that issue.
Just a second.
No worries.
That research sounds very interesting. I'm not familiar with it. Funnily enough, I did quote Brian Uzi in my book around what makes a high impact versus a low impact paper, but I'll have to check out his research, because it sounds like it's very complementary to what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Now, Whitney, we've talked about individuals. Can the S-curve also represent what is happening to an entire company? Or is a company just a portfolio of smaller S-curves for each project?
That's a great question. So what I would say, there's two answers to that. First of all, you can look at your entire company as a portfolio of S-curves. And so, for example, if you've got an entire company of 80% of your people in mastery, you're in trouble, because you don't have anybody thinking about innovating. You have people who are more in this place of, that's not how we do it here. And so you can look at, is my company optimized for growth based on what it is we're trying to do? and you look at, are they? And if you've got 80% mastery, you've got a challenge. So that's the first thing that you can think about. The second thing I think where you're going is that a company itself can be on an S curve. So a brand new company, a startup, is at the launch point of the S, and a company that's really humming and figured out the product market fit and they're growing very quickly is in the sweet spot of their growth. Then you have a company that's an old established company that's not growing very much. It is in mastery in terms of the S curve. So you would think of it as a cash cow, but yeah, it's very much a fractal. So you can go, your day is an S curve, your life is an S curve. That's what makes it so intriguing and useful, is to be able to, you can apply it in lots of different dimensions.
And then my last question, considering I've just had a look at the clock, the time's flown by, but I think we've got time for one last question. When it's someone else in a leadership position, a manager who's looking at their team and who is thinking what might be best for the company or what might be best for an individual, how might you approach these conversations around S-curves where you're maybe suggesting someone else can find new ways to energize themselves and push themselves, but that it might be very challenging at the start of this change to go through the frustration again?
Well, I would do what you just did, which is to use it as an artifact. We do have a tool. It's a 10-minute assessment that people can take, and they can see where they're presenting on the S curve. And it might be where they think they are, but then you've got 3 data points. You've got the assessment, you've got where they think they are, where you think they are. And so by just drawing that out, you can have that conversation and be able to say to someone, in mastery in particular, here's what's going on in your brain. Your brain's not learning. And so what that means is that on the downside is that you're bored. And so you could start to self-sabotage. This plateau could quickly become a precipice because you're going to start to dial it in. The positive spin to this, and they're both true, is that you now have latent innovative capacity. Because as we said, you're not making new memories. You just got all this capacity to make some new memories. And so would you like to figure out how to grow? I actually need you to do that, because longer term, if you're not growing, you can't stay here. I mean, you don't need to say that immediately, but let's figure out a way for you to grow. And so why don't you think about this? And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable here. So let's plan for that too, and talk through it and run some experiments and have a plan so that we make sure you don't derail in the process of, in the short term, you're going to feel like you're underperforming. But you can use this to help people manage expectations. And if you think about the S curve, one of the things it does is it's a dopamine management exercise. How do I manage the dopamine at the launch point? How do I harness it in the sweet spot? And how do I make sure I'm getting more once I'm in mastery? And if you're continually optimizing for that, then you're going to be able to help your people grow, and then they're going to grow, and then your company will grow.
Wise words to end by. Whitney, it's been wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out more about the book, about this tool that you mentioned, or about your services, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Yeah, the best place is to go to smartgrowthbook.com. That has everything that we've talked about. It's a good entry point. Obviously, you can go to Amazon, which always has every book everywhere. Go to a local bookstore. And then I have a podcast, and you can listen to that. We have the first chapter of the book that you can go listen to if you're intrigued and don't want to buy yet. And then I have, you can email me at wj@whitneyjohnson.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. Whitney, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Nick, thank you for having me.